The asphalt radiated the last of the day's heat, a tired gray ribbon separating the world of manicured lawns from the industrial quiet of the warehouse district. On one side of that ribbon, a little girl sat on the curb, her smallness made stark by the monolithic brick wall behind her. This was the clubhouse of the Iron Sentinels Motorcycle Club, a place most people in the town of Harmony Creek avoided. Its windows were dark, its massive steel door unadorned save for a single, stylized emblem of a stoic iron guardian. The girl, whose name was Lily, did not seem to care. She sat with her knees drawn to her chest, a piece of folded paper clutched in one hand, her gaze fixed on nothing. She was a statue of waiting, a silent question posed to the encroaching twilight. Inside, the world was leather and steel, the air thick with the scent of motor oil and old coffee. Forge, the club's president, stood by the front window, his back to the low hum of conversation in the common room. He was a man built of quiet angles and coiled stillness, his face a roadmap of long miles and hard decisions. He wasn't watching the street so much as observing it, a habit ingrained from years of needing to see trouble before it arrived. He had noticed the girl an hour ago, a small motionless figure in a faded pink jacket. Kids didn't play here, they didn't linger. Her presence was an anomaly, a loose thread in the tightly woven fabric of his world. He watched as a pristine black sedan slowed to a stop beside her. The window glided down and a man leaned over. From this distance, Forge couldn't hear the words, but he could read the language of posture. The man's smile was wide and polished, the kind meant to reassure. But Lily flinched. It was a movement so small it was almost imperceptible, a tightening of her shoulders, a slight retreat into herself. The man's voice, carried on the evening air, was smooth as honey. "Lily, sweetheart, there you are. I was so worried. Let's go home." The word home should have been a comfort. From the man's tone, it was meant to be. But Lily's small body went rigid. She shook her head, a tiny, desperate motion. The man's smile didn't falter, but something in his eyes, a flicker of cold impatience, reached Forge even from across the street. It was the look of a predator whose prey was refusing to cooperate. He opened his door, his movements still practiced and gentle, but underlined with an unnerving resolve. "Don't be difficult now, you know the rules." Forge's hand tightened on the window frame. His club was not a gang of thugs. They were men who had found a different kind of order, a code stricter than the one society offered. And that code was simple: you don't let the wolves get the lambs. The sight of the girl shrinking from that saccharine voice, from that predatory kindness, tripped a wire deep inside him. He turned from the window, his expression unreadable. "Anvil," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Stay here. Watch the door." He didn't wait for a response. He moved toward the steel door, his boots making no sound on the concrete floor. The hum of conversation in the room died as every eye turned to him, but no one spoke. They trusted his instincts. They always had. The heavy door clicked open, a sound that seemed to slice through the evening's quiet, and Forge stepped out into the cooling air, a silent, immovable object about to meet a dangerously persuasive force. Lily had been running the scenarios in her head for weeks. What would happen if she just walked away? What would happen if she told someone? Mr. Albright always had an answer. He would tilt his head, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners, and explain how no one would believe a little girl with a history of telling stories. He reminded her gently of what happened to her parents, how the world was a complicated place for orphans, how lucky she was to have him looking out for her. He was her case supervisor, her guardian angel in the confusing labyrinth of the foster care system. He brought her gifts, praised her drawings, and told her foster parents, the Millers, what a delightful, imaginative child she was. But his kindness felt like a cage. His gifts felt like payments for silence. Her life before this had been a blur of loss. A car accident had stolen her parents, leaving a void that was filled with a succession of strangers in sterile offices. Social workers, therapists, foster parents. They all spoke in soft, sympathetic tones, but their eyes were always distant, already moving on to the next file, the next tragedy. She had learned to be quiet, to be invisible. It was safer that way. The Millers were not unkind, just perpetually exhausted, their home a place of loud televisions and microwaved dinners. They were content to let Mr. Albright manage Lily's special needs. They believed him when he said she was a sensitive child who sometimes became confused. The confusion wasn't hers, it was his. He would visit once a week. The Millers would gratefully leave them alone to bond. He would ask her about school, about her friends, but his questions were traps. If she mentioned a new friend, that friend's parents would get a call about Lily's troubled past. Soon, the playdates would stop. If she expressed joy in a particular toy, it would disappear, and he would help her search for it, his face a mask of concern, telling her how things we love can sometimes get lost. He was an artist of quiet cruelty, an expert at making her feel like she was the one who was broken. The worst part was the basement in his own house, where he sometimes took her for special talks. It wasn't a place of chains or overt violence. It was worse. It was a small, soundproofed room with a single chair and a bare bulb. He would lock the door and sit with her in the suffocating silence, sometimes for an hour, telling her how important it was to keep their secrets, how this was their special game. He never laid a hand on her, but the terror he cultivated was more profound than any physical blow. It was the terror of absolute power, of being completely alone and unheard. She had tried to tell Mrs. Miller once. She had tried to explain the feeling of dread that descended whenever Mr. Albright's car pulled up. Mrs. Miller had patted her on the head, sighed, and said, "Mr. Albright is a good man, Lily. He does so much for children like you. You're just letting your imagination run away with you again." After that, Lily stopped trying. She channeled her fear into her drawings. On paper, she could be honest. She drew the Miller's house, bright and sunny. She drew her school. And she drew Mr. Albright's house. In her drawings, his house always had a dark, jagged shadow underneath it, a place filled with scribbled monsters, and a tiny stick-figure girl with a silent, screaming mouth. The drawing she clutched in her hand now was the most detailed one she had ever made. It was her last, desperate message in a bottle, thrown into an indifferent ocean. She had run from the Miller's house that afternoon after Mr. Albright called to say he was coming for an unscheduled visit. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away. She ended up here, in front of this fortress of brick and steel, drawn by a strange, illogical hope that monsters might be the only ones who could fight another monster. The Iron Sentinel's clubhouse was a converted auto body shop, and it still carried the ghosts of its former life. The main common area was a vast, open space where a collection of worn leather couches and armchairs were arranged around a massive coffee table made from an old engine block. The walls were exposed brick, adorned with framed photos of past members, long-forgotten road trips, and the club's charter, its calligraphy stark and severe. The rules were few but absolute. Loyalty to the Brotherhood, protection of the innocent. Your word is your bond. Never leave a brother behind. It was a simple creed, but for the men who wore the Guardian patch, it was scripture. They were not the outlaws of public imagination. They were mechanics, veterans, electricians, and even a retired librarian. They were men who had found the world outside their brotherhood to be lacking in honor, in structure. Here, they built it themselves. Forge, whose real name was Marcus Vance, had been a combat engineer in the Army. He'd seen firsthand how systems designed to protect could fail, how easily the vulnerable could be crushed under the wheels of bureaucracy. He had lost his own wife and daughter to a drunk driver whose wealth and connections had erased his crime. The law had failed him, so he had built his own law, his own family, on the chassis of a 1982 Harley-Davidson. Anvil, the club's sergeant-at-arms, was a mountain of a man who could rebuild a carburetor with the delicate touch of a surgeon. He rarely spoke more than a few words at a time, but his presence was a statement in itself. He had grown up in a violent home and had sworn he would never let a hand be raised in anger against a child in his presence. Doc, a former paramedic, was the club's conscience, the one who patched up their scrapes and their spirits. He kept a fully stocked medical kit that was better equipped than most ambulances, and a library of well-worn paperbacks he prescribed for various ailments of the soul. And then there was Crow, the quietest of them all. He was the club's eyes and ears, a man who could sit in a corner and notice everything: a nervous tick, a mismatched story, a lie hiding in plain sight. He had a knack for finding information, for following threads that others missed. Their days were structured and disciplined. Mornings were for maintenance, on the bikes, on the clubhouse. Afternoons were for their respective jobs. Evenings were for brotherhood. They shared meals, settled disputes with quiet deliberation, and planned charity rides. Their annual toy run was a local legend, a thundering parade of chrome and leather that delivered thousands of dollars in gifts to the children's hospital. The town of Harmony Creek viewed them with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. They kept to themselves, caused no trouble, and handled their own problems. But everyone knew that if you crossed a line, the Iron Sentinels would be the ones to draw it again, firmly and without compromise. They were a self-contained ecosystem of loyalty, a tribe bound not by blood, but by a shared code etched in iron and oil. And their leader was now walking calmly across a darkening street, his entire being focused on the small, trembling girl, and the man whose smile was a carefully constructed lie. The heavy click of the clubhouse door had drawn Mr. Albright's attention. He straightened up from leaning into his car, his pleasant facade momentarily replaced by a flash of annoyance. When he saw Forge approaching, a tall, broad-shouldered figure whose scarred knuckles and weathered leather vest spoke a language of unyielding strength, the annoyance morphed into something else: strategic condescension. He sized Forge up in an instant: a brute, a relic, an obstacle to be managed. "Can I help you?" Mr. Albright asked, his voice dripping with forced politeness. Forge didn't answer. His eyes were on Lily. She was staring at him, her own eyes wide with a terrifying mixture of hope and fear. He stopped a few feet away, creating a silent triangle between the man, the child, and himself. He gave Lily a slow, deliberate nod, a simple acknowledgement that said, "I see you." "This is a private matter," Mr. Albright said, taking a step toward Lily. "This little girl is in my care. She's had a difficult day and needs to get home." Forge shifted his weight, a subtle movement that blocked Albright's path to the girl. "She doesn't look like she wants to go with you." His voice was gravelly, calm, and carried an undeniable weight. Albright laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "Look, I appreciate your concern, but I'm a county supervisor with Child Protective Services. This is my job. Lily can be a bit dramatic. She has a very active imagination." He reached for Lily's arm. "Come on, sweetheart. Enough games." It was then that Lily acted. It wasn't a scream or a run. It was a small, calculated act of desperate genius. As Albright's fingers brushed her jacket, she let the folded paper fall from her hand. It fluttered to the asphalt, landing right at the tip of Forge's boot. Forge bent down slowly, his gaze never leaving Albright, and picked it up. He unfolded it. The drawing was crude, childlike, but its meaning was chillingly clear. A smiling sun, a boxy house, stick figures in the windows. But beneath the house, drawn with a heavy, angry black crayon, was a dark square. Inside it, a smaller stick figure lay on the floor, its mouth a silent "oh" of terror. Albright's face tightened. It's just a silly drawing. She's been having nightmares. Forge looked from the drawing to Lily. Her eyes were pleading with him. As he held her gaze, her lips formed a single, almost inaudible word, a whisper that barely disturbed the air between them. Basement. The word hung in the air, electric and damning. It was the key that unlocked the drawing, that turned a child's fantasy into a horrifying map. A tremor of panic, instantly suppressed, shot through Albright's eyes. He lunged for Lily, his carefully crafted patience finally shattering. "That's enough. You're coming with me right now." He never made it. Forge's arm shot out, not to strike, but to block. His hand, as large and solid as a cinder block, met Albright's chest, stopping him cold. It was not a violent shove, but an immovable statement of fact. "You will go no further." "The girl stays," Forge said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying more menace than any shout. Albright stumbled back, his face a mixture of fury and shock. He was a man accustomed to his authority being absolute, especially with people he considered his inferiors. "You have no right. You are interfering with a state official. I will have you and your entire pathetic club arrested for kidnapping." Forge didn't even blink. He simply looked at him, his silence more powerful than any threat. From across the street, the massive form of Anvil appeared in the clubhouse doorway, a silent sentinel reinforcing his president's position. The balance of power on that quiet street had irrevocably shifted. Realizing he had lost control, Albright retreated to his car, his face flushed with rage. He stabbed a finger at Forge. "This isn't over. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I'll be back with the police." He slid into his car, slammed the door, and sped away, leaving a squeal of tires and a heavy silence in his wake. Forge watched the car disappear before turning his full attention to Lily. She was shaking, her small body trembling with the aftermath of her courage. He knelt down, bringing himself to her level. He held out the drawing. "This is yours," he said gently. Then he held out his other hand. "It's getting cold. Why don't you come inside for a while? We've got hot chocolate." Lily looked at his calloused, oil-stained hand, then up at his stern, weathered face. For the first time in a very long time, she saw not a threat, but a shield. Hesitantly, she placed her small hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, surprisingly gentle, and he led her away from the lonely curb and toward the sanctuary of the Iron Guardian. The inside of the clubhouse was overwhelming at first. A dozen large men in leather vests stopped what they were doing and looked at her. The air smelled of old stories and gasoline, but there was no menace in their eyes, only a quiet, watchful curiosity. Anvil closed the heavy steel door behind them, and the sound of it locking echoed with a reassuring finality. It felt less like being trapped and more like being sealed inside a vault. Doc was the first to approach. He was a giant with a kind, lived-in face and hands that looked like they could palm a basketball. He knelt before Lily, his movements slow and deliberate. "Hey there," he said, his voice a soft rumble. "I'm Doc. You look like you could use something warm." He didn't wait for an answer, just went to the small kitchen area and came back with a steaming mug of hot chocolate, topped with a mountain of marshmallows. He handed it to her carefully. "Careful, it's hot." Lily took the mug with both hands, the warmth seeping into her frozen fingers. She didn't drink, just held it like a talisman. Forge led her to one of the big leather armchairs. It was huge, and she felt tiny in it, but it was also like being held. Doc appeared again with a thick wool blanket and draped it over her shoulders. No one was asking her questions. No one was demanding explanations. They were simply creating a space for her to breathe. Forge sat on the edge of the engine block table across from her, the unfolded drawing resting on his knee. The other members kept their distance, resuming their quiet activities but casting occasional, protective glances her way. They were a silent pack, circling a new, vulnerable member. "That's a good drawing," Forge said, his voice low and even. "You're a good artist." Lily risked a glance at him. He wasn't looking at her with pity. He was looking at her with respect. She took a small sip of the hot chocolate. It was the best she had ever tasted. The next morning, Mr. Albright made good on his threat. A police car and a county vehicle pulled up outside the clubhouse. Albright got out, accompanied by a uniformed officer and a harried-looking woman in a blazer, a social worker named Ms. Davies. Albright's demeanor was once again smooth and professional, but his eyes were hard. He was here to reassert his authority. Forge met them at the door, flanked by Anvil and Crow. He was calm, his hands resting loosely at his sides. "Mr. Vance," Albright began, his voice laced with official indignation, "I am here with Officer Riley and Miss Davies from Family Services to retrieve the child you are illegally holding. I suggest you cooperate fully." "The child is safe," Forge stated simply. "She is a ward of the state, and you are interfering with her care," Miss Davies said, clutching a clipboard to her chest like a shield. "We need to see her. Now." "You can see her," Forge replied, not moving an inch. "But she's not going anywhere with him." He nodded toward Albright. A flicker of fury crossed Albright's face. "This is outrageous. I am her legal supervisor. This gang has brainwashed her." "We gave her hot chocolate and a safe place to sleep," Forge said, his voice flat. "If that's brainwashing, then you have a different definition than I do." He looked past them, at Officer Riley, a young cop who looked deeply uncomfortable. "Officer, the girl was afraid. She indicated she was in danger. We're just making sure that's looked into before she's handed back to the man she's afraid of." "These are baseless accusations from a troubled child," Albright insisted. "I have a file thick with her behavioral issues, her penchant for fantasy." Forge held up the drawing. "She also has a penchant for detail." He held it out for Miss Davies and Officer Riley to see. She mentioned a basement, his basement. Albright scoffed. "My house doesn't even have a basement. It's built on a slab foundation, see? More fantasies. Now, are you going to hand her over? Or is Officer Riley going to have to arrest you for kidnapping?" The air grew thick with tension. The moment was a standoff, a test of wills. Forge's calm immovability against Albright's polished, systemic power. It was then that Crow, who had been silent until now, stepped forward slightly. He held up his phone. "That's funny," Crow said, his voice quiet but carrying. "Because the county assessor's website has blueprints for your property. Says right here, finished basement 400 square feet. I guess the county must have an active imagination, too." The blood drained from Albright's face. Miss Davies' eyes widened, and she took an involuntary step back from him. Officer Riley's hand, which had been drifting toward his sidearm, now rested on his radio instead. The polished mask had cracked, and for the first time, everyone on that sidewalk caught a glimpse of the monster hiding behind it. The confrontation was far from over, but the first decisive battle had just been won, not with fists, but with a quiet, indisputable fact. While Forge held the line at the clubhouse, Crow was already moving through the shadows of the digital world. He was a master of finding what was meant to stay hidden. He had started with public records, like the house blueprints, but now he delved deeper. He worked from a small, dark office in the back of the clubhouse, the glow of 3 monitors reflecting in his glasses. He wasn't a hacker in the criminal sense. He was a patient archaeologist of information, sifting through layers of public data, social media, and forgotten online forums. He started with Albright's professional history. The man had been with Child Protective Services for 15 years, lauded as a dedicated public servant. He'd won awards. But Crow looked at the data differently. He cross-referenced every child assigned to Albright's caseload with their subsequent placements. A pattern began to emerge, faint at first, then undeniable. A significant number of children under Albright's supervision were transferred to new foster homes or residential facilities due to sudden onset behavioral problems or emotional instability. These transfers often happened after a child had been in a stable home for months. They were always signed off by Albright himself, with glowing recommendations for more structured environments. He wasn't just moving kids around, he was curating his flock, weeding out any who might speak up, isolating the most vulnerable. Crow's search led him to a 5-year-old message board for former foster youth. He searched for Albright's name. He found one post, buried deep in an old thread. A user named Jaden K. had written, "Has anyone ever dealt with a CPS guy named Albright? He gives me the creeps, says he's helping, but it feels like he's trapping you." The post had no replies. Crow tracked the user's digital footprint, a delicate process of connecting old usernames to new profiles. He eventually found a Jaden Keller, now 19, working at a gas station 2 towns over. Meanwhile, Forge knew they needed an ally within the system, someone who couldn't be dismissed as a vigilante biker. He thought of Lily's teacher. He found her name, Ms. Garcia, in one of the school books Lily had in her worn backpack. He went to the elementary school the next afternoon. His presence in the bright, cheerful hallway caused an immediate stir. Teachers peeked out of their classrooms and the principal intercepted him with a wary expression. Forge simply asked to speak with Ms. Garcia about Lily. Elena Garcia was a young, earnest teacher who genuinely cared for her students. When Forge was shown into her empty classroom, she was nervous. She saw the leather, the tattoos, the grim set of his jaw. But when he spoke, his voice was quiet and respectful. He didn't make demands. He laid Lily's drawing on a small desk between them. "Lily drew this," he said. "She's with us. She's safe. But she's scared of that man, Mr. Albright." Ms. Garcia's first instinct was defensive. "Mr. Albright has been wonderful. He's very involved." He explained that Lily has been through a lot of trauma and can get confused. "Does she look confused to you?" Forge asked, tapping the dark square on the drawing. "Or does she look terrified?" The question hit Elena hard. She thought back over the past few months. Lily, once a bright, engaged student, had grown progressively quieter, more withdrawn. She had stopped raising her hand. She flinched at loud noises. Elena had noticed. She had even filed a report with the school counselor, but Albright had intercepted it. He had called her personally, thanking her for her concern and masterfully explaining it away as part of Lily's adjustment period. He had made her feel like she was overreacting. Looking at the drawing now, at the stark terror depicted in it, Elena felt a cold wave of guilt. She had been complicit in her silence. "What do you need?" she asked, her voice firm. "We're going to talk to the police," Forge said. "It would help if someone like you was there, someone they'll listen to." They went to the police station together, the towering biker and the determined young teacher. They asked for Detective Miller, a veteran cop with a reputation for being thorough and cynical. Miller listened to their story with a stony expression, his eyes betraying nothing. He looked at Forge with suspicion and at Miss Garcia with a hint of pity, a biker club and a worried teacher. It sounded like a messy custody dispute, not a serious crime. "A scary drawing and a feeling aren't enough to get a warrant, Mr. Vance," Miller said, his tone weary. "Albright is a respected county official. I can't just go knocking on his door based on this." "He lied about the basement," Forge stated. "A lie isn't a crime," Miller countered. "But it's a foundation," Forge said, his gaze steady. "A foundation for a bigger lie." Miller was about to dismiss them when Miss Garcia spoke. "He isolated her," she said, her voice shaking slightly but clear. "He told me her grandmother, her only living relative, was unstable. He told me her friends at school were a bad influence. I have emails from him. He was building a wall around her, and I helped him lay the bricks." That gave Miller pause. The emails constituted a pattern of behavior. It wasn't just a feeling anymore, it was documented. "Okay," he said slowly, leaning forward. "Let me see the emails, and tell me everything from the beginning." The gears of justice, rusted from institutional indifference, were beginning to grind slowly into motion. The story broke on a Tuesday. A local news station, tipped off by an anonymous source within the county building who was loyal to Albright, ran a sensationalized piece. The headline read, "Local motorcycle gang holds foster child hostage. Alleges abuse by decorated social worker." The report painted the Iron Sentinels as a dangerous cult that had preyed on a vulnerable girl. It featured a file photo of Albright accepting a Humanitarian of the Year award and a grainy, long-lens shot of Anvil standing guard outside the clubhouse, making him look menacing. The effect on the town was immediate and divisive. The clubhouse, once simply ignored, became the focal point of public anxiety. Cars slowed as they drove by, their occupants staring. A small group of protesters gathered on the opposite curb, holding signs that said, "Give back the girl," and "Bikers aren't babysitters." They were fueled by fear, and a narrative that was easy to swallow. Bikers bad, official good. Inside, the mood was tense. Some of the younger members wanted to go out and confront the protesters, to clear their name with loud words and intimidation. Forge shut it down immediately. "We don't move," he commanded at their evening meeting, his voice cutting through the angry murmurs. "We don't speak, we stand our ground. They can have the noise. We have the truth, let them burn themselves out." And so they did. They went about their business with a quiet, unyielding dignity. When they left or entered the clubhouse, they walked past the jeers and signs without a word, their silence a more powerful statement than any shouted defense. They were a wall of leather and resolve, and Lily was safe behind it. But they weren't the only ones standing their ground. Ms. Garcia, horrified by the news report, refused to be silent. She started making calls. She spoke to other teachers, to parents from her class. She told them about the Lily she knew, the bright, artistic girl who had been slowly fading away. She shared her own guilt, her own regret for not acting sooner. Her honesty was compelling. A few days later, a different kind of crowd began to gather. It started with Miss Garcia and two other teachers, standing quietly near the protesters, holding simple, hand-drawn signs that said, "We believe Lily." The next day, a dozen parents from the school joined them. They brought thermoses of coffee and offered them not only to their fellow supporters, but to the police officers assigned to monitor the situation. They didn't chant or shout. They stood in a silent vigil, a counter-narrative of quiet community support. The town was now a physical representation of the battle being waged. On one side of the street, loud, misinformed anger. On the other, a growing line of quiet, determined belief. The media, scenting a more complex story, began to change its tone. Reporters started asking harder questions. Why had so many children been removed from Albright's care? Why was a respected teacher standing with a motorcycle club? The public reckoning was happening, not in a courtroom, but on the curb of an industrial street. It was a slow, powerful shift in the town's consciousness. People who had once crossed the street to avoid the bikers now found themselves standing with them, united by a simple, powerful idea. A child's safety was more important than comfortable assumptions. The Iron Sentinels had become an unlikely lightning rod, attracting the town's fear, but also its courage. They had held the line long enough for others to find the strength to join them. Detective Miller was a man who trusted process, but Crow's information and Miss Garcia's conviction had planted a seed of doubt that was now growing into a thicket of suspicion. He did his own digging into Albright's case files and found the same disturbing pattern Crow had, a trail of children labeled difficult, who were shuffled away into deeper, darker corners of the system. The lie about the basement was the linchpin. A man who would lie about something so concrete could lie about anything. The final piece fell into place when Crow, after days of patient, gentle persuasion, finally convinced Jaden Keller to come forward. Jaden, now a lanky 19-year-old with haunted eyes, walked into Miller's office. His voice trembled as he spoke, but his words were clear. He described Albright's methods of control, the psychological games, the way he isolated him from anyone who might listen, and he described the quiet room in the basement. He had never been physically harmed, but he talked about being locked in there for hours. The suffocating silence designed to break his will, to teach him that Albright was the only one in the world who mattered. Jaden's testimony was the key. It was the corroborating evidence from a second, unrelated victim. Miller now had more than enough for a search warrant. The raid on Albright's pristine suburban home was quiet and professional. Miller led the team himself. The house was immaculate, tastefully decorated, the very picture of respectability. But when they opened the door to the basement, a chill went through the room. It was finished, just as the blueprints had said. A den with a large television, a wet bar. But at the far end was another door, a thick, solid core door with a heavy-duty deadbolt on the outside. Inside was the room Jaden had described. It was small, carpeted, and the walls were covered in thick acoustic paneling. A single, hard-backed chair sat in the center under a bare bulb. It was a sensory deprivation chamber, a place of profound psychological terror. There was more. In a locked filing cabinet, they found neatly labeled files, not just for Lily and Jaden, but for a dozen other children. Each file contained personal items: a lost hair ribbon, a small toy car, a photograph. Trophies. Souvenirs from his campaigns of terror. Albright was arrested at his office. He didn't struggle. He maintained his composure, his face a mask of shocked indignation. He called it all a terrible misunderstanding, the result of a conspiracy by a violent gang and a hysterical teacher. But the evidence was overwhelming. The trophies, the room, Jaden's testimony, and the mountain of procedural red flags in his case files, it all painted a portrait of a meticulous, patient predator who had weaponized the very system meant to protect children. The most crucial part of the case, however, was Lily. She had to give a statement. The process was handled at a child advocacy center, a building designed to feel safe and welcoming. Lily was nervous, but she wasn't alone. Forge and Ms. Garcia sat in the waiting room. They had told her she didn't have to do anything she didn't want to, but Lily was resolute. She wanted to tell her story. In a soft-lit room with a trained forensic interviewer, Lily finally spoke. She talked about the lost toys, the threats disguised as advice, the feeling of being watched. When she found it hard to use words, she used her drawings. She laid them out on the table, a storyboard of her fear. She pointed to the dark square. "This is the quiet room," she whispered. "He calls it the thinking place. But you can't think in there. You can only be scared." Her testimony was quiet, understated, and absolutely devastating. Her simple, honest words, backed by the physical evidence, shattered Albright's respectable facade forever. The legal system, so often a blunt and clumsy instrument, was finally focused with pinpoint accuracy. The charges were filed, multiple counts of false imprisonment, child endangerment, and abuse of power. Justice, which had been blind for so long, was finally beginning to see. The arrest of Arthur Albright sent shockwaves through the county. The man who had been the face of child advocacy was revealed to be a monster hiding in plain sight. The case triggered an immediate and sweeping internal investigation into the Department of Child and Family Services. What the investigators found was not a system of evil people, but something almost worse, a system of profound, negligent trust. Albright's long tenure and stellar reputation had made him virtually immune to oversight. Paperwork was rubber-stamped. His explanations for moving children were accepted without question. The system had been designed to trust its own, and he had exploited that trust to its absolute limit. The public outcry was immense. Town hall meetings were packed with angry parents and concerned citizens. The story was no longer about a biker gang. It was about the fundamental failure of a community to protect its most vulnerable. The Iron Sentinels, once viewed as pariahs, were now hailed as heroes. Forge was asked to speak at a public forum on child safety. He stood at the podium, uncomfortable in the spotlight, and his speech was only a few sentences long. "We're not heroes," he said, his voice a low rumble that filled the auditorium. "We just listened. That's all it took. A little girl was trying to tell everyone she was in danger, and nobody was listening. The system needs to change. You need to listen to the kids. It's that simple." His words became a rallying cry. The subsequent reforms were extensive and named, unofficially at first, Lily's Law. A new, independent oversight board was created for the Child Welfare Agency, with 2 seats reserved for community advocates. Anvil, much to his own surprise, was nominated and elected to one of them. His blunt, no-nonsense approach to bureaucracy proved remarkably effective. A new policy of mandatory, unannounced wellness checks by a 2-person team was implemented. No longer would a single caseworker hold absolute power over a child's life. A fully funded child advocacy program was established, ensuring every child in the system had a dedicated, independent voice to speak for them. The Iron Sentinels themselves underwent a transformation in the public eye. They were no longer just a motorcycle club. They were guardians. Donations began pouring in from all over the state. With the funds, they established a charitable foundation called the Sentinel Fund. Its mission was simple: to provide immediate material and legal support for at-risk children. They bought a small house near the clubhouse and converted it into Lily's Place, a temporary safe house for kids who had nowhere else to go, a warm and welcoming stopgap for those failed by the official system. The legacy of that one small girl sitting on a curb was monumental. Her courage had not just exposed a single predator, it had forced an entire community to re-examine its definition of safety, trust, and responsibility. The changes were not just on paper, they were cultural. People started paying more attention. Teachers were trained to recognize the subtle signs of psychological abuse. Neighbors started looking out for each other's kids in a way they hadn't before. Harmony Creek began to live up to its name, not because it was a town without problems, but because it had learned to face its darkest problems together. The ripple effects of Lily's quiet bravery had created a tidal wave of change, leaving the entire community safer and stronger in its wake. The seasons turned. The harsh glare of the media faded, replaced by the quiet, steady work of healing and rebuilding. Autumn arrived, blanketing Harmony Creek in hues of gold and amber. Lily was no longer the small, frightened girl on the curb. She had been placed with a new foster family, a warm, boisterous couple who happened to live just a few blocks from the clubhouse. The placement had been overseen by the new advocacy board, with Anvil personally reviewing every line of their file. She was a regular visitor at the clubhouse now. She wasn't a victim seeking refuge, she was family. She would arrive after school, her backpack full of books and drawings, and the entire atmosphere of the place would soften. She taught the grizzled bikers the finer points of card games, consistently beating them at Go Fish. She helped Doc tend the small vegetable garden he had planted out back. She would sit for hours in the garage, watching them work on their bikes, asking endless questions about pistons and spark plugs. On a crisp Saturday afternoon, she was in the yard with Anvil. He was sitting cross-legged on the grass, a position that looked deeply unnatural for a man his size, a sketch pad balanced on his knees. Lily stood over him, a tiny instructor with a serious expression. "No, no," she said, tapping the paper. "The exhaust pipes have to be bigger. They have to sound like thunder." Anvil grunted and dutifully erased the pipes, starting again under her strict supervision. Forge watched them from the clubhouse porch, leaning against a post, a mug of coffee warming his hands. A small, genuine smile touched his lips. He saw this scene and knew that all the tension, all the risk, had been worth it. A mail truck rumbled by, and the carrier left a few letters in their box. Forge walked over and sorted through them. Bills, bike part catalogs, and a crisp white envelope from the Harmony Creek Police Department. He opened it. It was a handwritten note from Detective Miller. "Forge," it read, "I wanted to thank you. Not just for helping with the Albright case, but for reminding me what my job is supposed to be about. It's easy to get lost in the paperwork and the process and forget that it's all supposed to be about protecting people. You guys listened when no one else would. You did the right thing, even when it was the hard thing. The town is safer because of it. If you ever need anything, you know where to find me." Forge folded the letter and tucked it into his vest pocket. He looked back at Lily and Anvil, now laughing as Anvil tried to draw a puff of smoke that looked more like a sheep. The sound of her laughter was the sound of a promise kept. Later that evening, as the sun set, Forge walked through the quiet common room of the clubhouse. He stopped in front of the wall of photos, the club's history captured in silver frames. He hung a new frame. It didn't hold a photo, but a child's drawing. It was the one Lily had dropped on the asphalt that first night, the one with the dark, terrifying square under the house. But now it was part of a diptych. Next to it, in the same frame, was a new drawing she had made for him last week. It was the same house, but the dark basement was gone. In its place, she had drawn a row of magnificent, rumbling motorcycles standing guard on the front lawn. They were rendered with surprising detail, especially the exhaust pipes, which were big and bold. Above them all, the sun was shining, its rays reaching every corner of the page. It was a picture of a world made safe, a testament to the fact that sometimes the most formidable guardians don't wear badges or uniforms, but leather and steel, and a code of honor that demands they listen to the quietest voices. The Brotherhood rode on, their engines a low thunder, a constant, reassuring presence on the edge of town. The world was safer, not because a monster had been caged, but because a child had been heard.